Well, good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you're logging in from. Welcome to this book launch event hosted by the Center for Geopolitics here at the University of Cambridge. My name is Judd Birdsall, and I direct the Religion and International Studies program at the Center for Geopolitics here in Cambridge. The center's work is very much grounded in applied history, connecting analysis of the past to the geopolitical challenges of the present. And so we're thrilled to host tonight's event looking at how rival visions and understandings of America's history impact its contemporary political dynamics and debates. Tonight's event will feature a discussion on Dr. Matthew Rowley's new book, Trump and the Protestant Reaction to Make America Great Again. Matthew and I have been colleagues and collaborators for several years. He lived in Cambridge while completing his PhD at the University of Leicester, where he's an honorary visiting fellow. He continues to be very much involved in our project on Protestant political thought and is involved in several of the publications part of that project. And he wrote this new book on Trump and Protestants basically as an extracurricular activity for himself, which is enormously impressive. We're also delighted to be joined by Reverend Angela Denker, who will serve as a discussant and respondent. Reverend Denker has a very interesting background as a former sports writer turned Lutheran pastor, and she's the author of Red State Christians, Meet the Voters Who Elected Donald Trump. We'll begin this evening's event with some opening remarks from Matthew, then a response from Angela, perhaps a question or two from me for our panelists, and then we'll use the remainder of our time for Q&A with the audience. We'll conclude right around 7 p.m. UK time. And Angela is much in demand as a speaker and actually needs to sign off about 5 minutes before then for another event. This is a Zoom webinar, so the cameras and microphones of our audience members are automatically turned off for the duration of the event, but you can participate by asking questions of our panelists. If you want to do so, you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window when it appears. And if you do ask a question, please give us your name and your affiliation. Also let us know to whom you are addressing your question. And to be as brief as you can in wording your questions so we can get through as many of those as possible. I should also mention that this event is being recorded, and the video will be posted on our website within the next few days. Again, thanks to all of you for joining this call from around the world. Thanks especially to our panelists for sharing their insights and their analysis. Delighted to have them with us. Matthew, we'll start with you. Congratulations on this new book, and we look forward to hearing from you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Judd. I want to thank Angela for being here and joining the panel. It's clear from the outset of her book that she doesn't support President Trump, but she adamantly supports understanding why people voted for him. And if more people work to understand those they disagree with, this would be a far more charitable country to live in, and we may even have better politicians to vote for. So thank you for coming on this panel and for your book. The contest for America's future is a struggle over its past. Because Americans lack a shared memory, increased historical reflection contributes to polarization. History is a common ground, and for that reason, it is also a battleground. In other words, American history is a foreign country. The left and right both vacation there, but they don't like bumping into each other on the beach. Trump's 2016 campaign made a fundamental historical claim. America was great, and he will make America great again. This is a statement about national decline wrapped in a vision of progress. But what kind of claim is MAGA? What will MAGA restore? I argue that there are two polarized interpretations of Trump's slogan, and partisans would do well to become acquainted with the other side. There is an inclusive interpretation of MAGA and an exclusive interpretation. In the inclusive interpretation, many on the right argue that Make America Great Again really means Make America Great Again for all Americans. All Americans, they argue, will benefit from Trump's plan. Those who make this argument tend to say that Black Lives Matter is divisive and all lives matter is inclusive. In contrast to this interpretation, others argue that MAGA is exclusive. They cite Trump's racist rhetoric and policies as Exhibit A in the argument that MAGA will benefit white Christian males. These people view Black Lives Matter as inclusive since it demands equal treatment for minorities. Although all lives matter might sound like a confession of equality, they argue that it deliberately obscures inequality and injustice in America's past and present. Those arguing for the inclusive and exclusive interpretations of MAGA both appeal to American history, but they remember and forget different aspects of the past. Consider the following question. Is America great because it removed the knee from the slave's neck, or is America wicked because it knelt over the slave for centuries? This question would likely divide Americans along ideological lines. However, the polarized divide masks many similarities. Whether you conclude that America is great or wicked, both conclusions require moral mathematics. Both sides weigh American greatness against American failure. However, measuring the merit of a nation is a complicated business. What standard would be used to measure the greatness of a nation? Do we judge America by its high ideals? Do we compare America to other nations? Or is progress the yardstick of greatness? There is also the question of selection. Should George Washington's subordination of women be taken as evidence against American greatness? Or should we only focus on his expansion of democracy? Should Thomas Jefferson be reviled for enslaving humans or revered for enshrining liberty? Is America great because it raised the standard of living or wicked because it reduced the situation of Native Americans? Is Margaret Sanger a champion of female liberation, or does her advocacy of eugenics make her a villain? The verdict on national greatness largely depends on the standard that's being used and the selection of evidence that is allowed in court. Many people exclude certain evidence from court, but they do so for very different reasons. So the verdict on American greatness is closely related to the fears and anxieties that Americans have about the present. Very real fears and anxieties inform how the right and the left approach the past. The right tends to worry that denigrating American history will unmoor the nation from what made it a force for good on the domestic and international stage. Americans cannot do good if it does not remember the values that made it good in the past. The left tends to worry that selective nostalgia ignores racism, sexism, violence, and exploitation in the past. America cannot overcome present injustice if it doesn't confront its past. These debates lay at the heart of my book, Trump and the Protestant Reaction to Make America Great Again. The book tries to understand why Americans remember and forget different aspects of the past. Partisan memories are often incompatible and incomplete. Dare I say they are incompatible because they are incomplete. Like the nation itself, American Protestants lack a shared memory. This book analyzes the historical reflections of dozens of Protestant ministers, professors, authors, activists, and historians. These Protestants, I argue, have three approaches to the American past. I call the first the Make America Great Again position, the second, Make America Lament, and the third, Make America Better. First, Make America Great Again. These Protestants carry around a burden of memory containing court cases that marginalize God and Christian ethics in the public square. They argue that America turned from its founding, most notably in the 1950s, and restoring greatness involves recovering what made America great between the 1620s and the 1950s. These Protestants believe that opponents of American greatness denigrate a noble and uplifting past. The left, they think, runs through American history with chisel and axe, toppling anything that falls short of their current liberal platform. When Make America Great Again Protestants invoke history, they tend to remember the good. For example, they foreground the moral crusade against slavery and background centuries of Christian justifications for enslavement. They leave certain historical details off the scales when weighing greatness. For example, land theft, slavery, and second-class citizenship for women. These Protestants will criticize parts of American past, but these features are presented as an aberration from the uplifting norm, and they only offer small doses of criticism. Perhaps they think that some national sins, like slavery and racism, are so heavy that they will forever tip the scales. Therefore, they seem to bracket out America's weightiest failures when they are calculating American greatness. What should Americans do in the present? These Protestants argue that America needs to admire the individuals, ideas, and events that made it great, and then America will be moved to greatness. By focusing on the negative in the past, Americans will become harsh, judgmental, unforgiving, and self-righteous. The second group are Make America Lament Protestants. For them, Scripture has much to say about godly lament. When they call for lament, they are inviting people into the pain, vulnerability, and hurt that stem from centuries of injustice. These Protestants are burdened by injustices that date back to the colonial era, most notably land theft, slavery, and female subordination. The past, they argue, is not in the past, citing ongoing prejudice informs the range from voter suppression to the new Jim Crow to police brutality. Present-day gaps in wealth, education, incarceration, and healthcare, for example, are directly connected to these historic injustices. The past is past. It barges into the present with no-knock warrants. When they hear claims of American greatness, they fear that this denies, dismisses, or glorifies America's racist, sexist, land-grabbing past. MAGA, they fear, may even be a way of turning the clock back on on progress. These Protestants might admire aspects of the deeply flawed past, but they background praise and foreground critique. They remove some parts of American history from the scales, but they do so for very different reasons. They tend to fear that positive history and patriotic appeals might short-circuit national repentance and restitution. Some of these Protestants seem allergic to speaking fondly about America's past. Americans should not lull themselves to sleep with self-congratulatory tales about the expansion of rights and freedoms, not with the glaring injustices of the present. Revering Lincoln, who wanted emancipation but not racial equality, is inappropriate at a time when police are killing unarmed minorities or when neo-Nazis openly parade. By revering racists in the past, they argue, Americans will overlook racism in the present. These Protestants seem imbalanced, but their reasoning might have more to do with the challenges of the present. Perhaps if more Americans remembered past injustice, if more Americans lamented the ongoing nature of prejudice and inequality, if more resolved to work towards change, then these Protestants might find it appropriate to remember what went right in the American past. A third group of Protestants wants to make America better. They are uncomfortable with claims to national greatness, but they also worry that imbalanced criticism of the past is an obstacle to securing justice in the present. Their writings emphasize that there have always been two Americas, the founding ideal and the founding reality. The reality was unequal and unjust. The ideal laid the groundwork for justice and equality. America's enduring racism and the drive for equality flow from the same source. Therefore, most historical persons, institutions, or documents should not be totally rejected or totally embraced. The Make America Better approach emphasizes past injustices, but also stresses that there was more to persons, institutions, documents, or events. It resists a zero-sum struggle over history. The bad, and the bad exists in abundance, is truly lamentable. The good, and the good exists in abundance, is truly admirable. The good is not primarily weighed against the bad. It is doubtful if any amount of good could ever outweigh the theft of land from Native Americans or the enslavement of African Americans, for example. Ignoble aspects of the past are set alongside noble ones, not primarily weighed against them. America falls short of its ideals, especially when they were first articulated, but these ideals also move the country towards justice and equality. These Protestants tend to reject using moral scales to declare a verdict over 4 centuries of history. Yes, historical events and persons should be morally assessed. However, they tend to shy away from pronouncing a verdict over all of American history. Great is not the word to describe America's past, but neither is wicked. The past has elements of both, and one should not try to weigh the good against the bad. These Protestants tend to be allergic to nostalgia. They do not sweep the ugly reality of American history under the rug. In fact, they insist on remembering this history, lamenting it, and working towards restitution. In this regard, they are very close to the Make America Lament position. However, they make one more crucial step. In addition to lamenting history, they add a tempered and qualified appreciation for the flawed figures of the past, unjust hypocrites though they be. A better America comes through lament, but Americans should also be energized by looking at who and what made the country progressively better. These Protestants vocalize a deep appreciation for their deeply flawed nation. If Make America Great Again Protestants have a hard time articulating what went wrong in American history, Make America Lament Protestants have a hard time articulating what went right. Make America Better Protestants frame the critique of historical injustice as an act of patriotism. It is patriotic to remove the plaster that previous generations placed over historical evils. Critiquing the nation is not a sign of disloyalty, but of natural maturity. America has come of age when it can squarely face its past. For all these groups, discussing history is not merely an intellectual exercise. History barges into the present and fights about religious liberty or the role of Christianity in the public sphere. Historical injustice influences medical treatment, housing, and education. It rears its ugly head in racial profiling. It surfaces in assumptions about who and what should be admired in American history. I wrote the conclusion in the wake of the historical reckoning that followed the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Since then, competing and incompatible versions of American history have been on full display. Trump's July 2020 speech before Mount Rushmore was perhaps his clearest articulation of when America was great and who made it great. I contrast this speech with Al Sharpton's eulogy for George Floyd and his subsequent speech at a Juneteenth rally in Tulsa. Sharpton argues that Trump's version of American history must be laid to rest before the nation can progress towards greatness. By contrasting Trump with Sharpton, a stark ideological difference emerges. However, there are also important similarities in how they approach the past. Both agree that the nation will resemble what it reveres. America will come to look like who they admire in the past. According to Trump, if Americans cherish what made America great, the nation will be moved towards greatness. He argues that those who constantly point out the flaws in the past will become harsh, uncharitable, and take it upon themselves to censor all they disagree with. Al Sharpton uses a similar argument, but arrives at the opposite conclusion. If Americans are critical of the past, they will be moved to oppose injustice in the present. However, if Americans revere racist, they will remain racist. In the conclusion, I argue that we need to bridge the polarized interpretation of history so that the push for justice and equality in the present can be a bipartisan effort. We need a shared national memory. When Americans think about the past, we need to start thinking about similar things. In short, Americans need to confess the past and connect the dots between past and present. Americans need to be willing to confess what went wrong in American history and also what went right. But confessing the wrong is particularly important. American history is inseparable from racism, the theft of land, and legalized inequality. Racial disparities in the present were not created ex nihilo. They have a long history, and confession simply acknowledges that these things happened. Americans also need to become more skilled at connecting the dots between the past and the present. Many of the liberties Americans enjoy are directly owing to historical institutions, individuals, and documents. Also, many of the injustices and inequalities that we face have deep historical roots. We need to become more skilled at connecting these dots between the past and the present. In the book, I highlight 3 of many obstacles that stand in the way of having a shared memory. First, many Americans confuse the emancipation of slaves with the desire for racial equality. Historically speaking, most who wanted slavery to end were opposed to racial equality. In other words, one could be a committed racist and an abolitionist at the same time. We should not confuse being anti-slavery with being anti-racist. So that's the first confusion. The second confusion comes a century later. Many Americans confuse the expansion of civil rights with a commitment to racial equality. After emancipation, every attempt, often successful, was made to reduce non-whites to second-class citizenship. The civil rights movement only partially remedied this situation. Once again, many Americans mistook the expansion of rights with anti-racism, minimizing alarming continuities between slavery, the civil rights movement, and the present. These two confusions are made worse by a third factor, a century-long memory gap that spans from the death of Lincoln to the civil rights movement. Many white Americans are simply not aware of the big and small ways that individuals, institutions, and the government tried to reduce African Americans to their former subjugation. White accounts of this forgotten century tend to write minorities out of the story, or sanitize the unflattering elements, or weave an optimistic tale out of the tattered shreds of racism. Whites look fondly at the Civil War that secured freedom for enslaved persons. However, many are not well acquainted with the century-long effort to carry on slavery under other names. As a result, Americans overestimate the progress from the 1860s to the 1960s, precisely because they don't know the details that are between them. In the book, Learning from the Germans, Susan Neiman argues that Americans need to come to terms with their past. As a first step, she argues, the nation must achieve a coherent and widely accepted national narrative. Because the Make America Great Again and Make America Lament positions only emphasize parts of the story, they are unlikely to become the widely accepted narrative. The Make America Better position, in my estimation, is most likely to support a coherent and widely accepted national narrative. The Make America Better position is not a Goldilocks stance that says America is not as bad as some claim and not as good as claimed by others. Rather, Make America Better comes after lamentation. It does not detract from it. It is a critical step beyond it. Having confessed the past, having recognized the way the past impacts the present, having determined to work towards remedy and reconciliation, what now? How do you interact with the history you lament? What parts of American history can Americans cherish and take pride in? The Make America Better position holds history in tension. The repulsive aspects of America's past are legion and truly evil, but that is not all there is to the story. They may not be able to say that America was ever great, and certainly not for everyone, but they can work to make America better. Make America Better Protestants find tools in the past, in individuals, institutions, events, and documents that are riddled with hypocrisy and short-sighted exclusion. And these tools help in the construction of a more just and equal America. Perhaps the greatest strength of this position is in how it frames the struggle ahead. Mature nations own the past and rectify wrong. National self-critique is patriotic. As Susan Neiman argued in Learning from the Germans, having the will to face your history can be a show of strength. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Matthew, for your very clear and insightful remarks. I want to go straight now to Angela for her response.
Yes, well, thank you for having me. I'm reminded of shortly before my book came out in July of 2019, I did my first sort of pre-launch event in rural northern Wisconsin in the Northwoods, and of course, the state that is perhaps most pivotal for the 2020 election. And when I gave the presentation, I had a student come up to me afterwards and she said, okay, I'm a political science major. I'm wanting to be a historian. What research methods did you use for your travels across America? And I'm reminded of that question because we're having this discussion today, of course, with Matthew, who has worked most of his life as an academic, and I imagine many of you on the call as well are coming from academia. And so I found in the time since my book came out in August of 2019, that the work that I did in Red State Christians provides a really nice complement to the work of academics and historians and political scientists, because much of the work that you all have done and that Matthew does a bit in his work as well is looking at sort of the quantitative and academic studies of American history. And the companion that my work and my experience provides is really a qualitative interview-based experience of American voters. So just a little bit of background on where I'm coming from and where my research meets up with Matthew's. So as Judd had mentioned, I worked for about 5 years professionally as a sports writer, and then entered seminary and became ordained as a Lutheran pastor. In 2016, during the election of Donald Trump, I was serving as co-pastor of a very large Lutheran in name, evangelical in style church in Southern California in Orange County. Happened to be right next door to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library. So the church and Orange County itself is very rooted in the sort of old school, wealthy, conservative evangelicalism that has formed the backbone of much of Donald Trump's support and Christian support in particular. So I watched 2016 happen from the vantage point of a former journalist and also as a pastor, and just watching the way that this election uniquely divided even my own church, and to see people who for a long time had gathered together after worship to eat donuts together and to gripe about the sermon, they no longer sat together after church. I had children calling me saying I can no longer talk to my parents about this election. I feel so distant from them. Parents saying I don't understand where my son or daughter is coming from. Kids having incidents at school. So at that point, I became convinced that this election, it was important that there would be a work that would come out that would focus on a pastoral perspective, a theological perspective. I think, again, coupled with Matthew's work, it's important to understand the theological underpinnings of much of Christian thought that has become aligned with Make America Great Again, and why Make America Great Again is so attractive to a lot of American Christians who have embraced this idea of America almost as a holy land. So if you think of, for the Jewish people, that Israel represents the Holy Land, for many American Christians, there has become this idea that America itself is a holy land. And initially, that idea, I think Matthew could speak to how that idea operated for early American settlers and Puritans, but I also think of American Mormons and their attachment to America as Holy Land. But it's become a much more widespread phenomenon today. So that theological perspective is important. The pastoral perspective is important. I also thought that it was really important that individual voters across America and Christians across America had the opportunity to share their stories. As Matthew mentions, this is quite a diverse country, and Christianity is very diverse in this country. And too often in American media, and as a journalist, I want to support media, but I do see very much a lack of religious and certainly theological literacy when it comes to reporting on Christian voters. So often there are segments of the population who are entirely missed. There are nuances, there's language that's misunderstood. So I wanted to have the opportunity in my book to really give people the chance to tell their own stories, and for readers to find commonalities with people with whom they thought they had nothing in common with. So I spent 2018, I left that church in California. Sadly, it was a wonderful church, but I had this opportunity to spend 2018, I worked part-time at a large church here in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, and then spent the rest of 2018 traveling across America to interview Christians in red counties. So not every person who I interviewed voted for Trump. Not every person who I interviewed remains a Trump supporter today. But I thought it was important to understand the Christian culture in these hotbeds of sort of cultural incubators that led to an American Christian conservative embrace of Trump. So that work led to Red State Christians. And then I've spent that time afterwards continuing to look at the research I've done, continuing to see how that research has been shaped in two really dynamic ways here in 2020 by the COVID-19 pandemic. Part of the work that I wanted to do was understand, of course, the centrality of the pro-life movement and the idea of sanctity of life for American Christians, and how COVID-19 has caused a re-examination of an understanding of which politicians truly support the lives of Americans, and which political party has the right to say that they are truly the party of life in America at a time when we've lost more than 200,000 Americans to COVID. And then the other defining event that has reshaped the research that I've done is, as Matthew has referenced, the killing of George Floyd here in Minneapolis, 4 miles from my home. And that has caused me to really speak more clearly and understand more clearly the role that race has played in the dominance of Christian nationalism. And for a long time, I talked about Christian nationalism. I talked about, to American audiences, the importance that we understand, difficult as it may be for us as Americans, that Jesus is not American. But after the killing of George Floyd and just a continued re-examination of some of the racist roots of our view of America, I think it's also been important for white American Christians to understand that Jesus is also not white, and perhaps that's even the more important teaching that we hold on to. So I've written a lot of notes about what Matthew has said, and I've also read his book and thought about some things as well. I'd like to talk more about, and I'll say this and then I want to turn it back over to Judd. But one thing that I wanted to talk about is a study that made a big impression on me, came out in late 2017 from the Brookings Institute, I believe. It was a study that showed that poor people of color in America, people living under the poverty line, who are people of color in America, tend to be much more optimistic about the future than do white Americans who are living in poverty. And I think we really saw Trump capitalize on that. And this idea of that Make America Great Again has been used in the past by President Ronald Reagan, by President George Bush. But it was Trump's dark and dim view of America that sort of twists this history of Make America Great Again, in my view. So that while people may look to the further back past with these rose-colored glasses, this understanding of what has happened since the 1960s, which incidentally is when civil rights were passed in America. But I'd like to examine that more. And for me, where I found the most hopefulness in my research and my hope for America's future and Christianity in America's future, I often found in the Black church, in Latino churches and Latino ministers, and just in these marginalized traditions in America that have often been the ones to reclaim the gospel. So looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Angela, for your response to Matthew and for sharing a bit about your own story and the process of researching your book, which can be found on Amazon. I would encourage everyone to check that one out as well. There it is. Several questions have come in already. Again, if you want to ask a question, click on the Q&A button in your Zoom window. Let us know your name and affiliation and to whom you're asking your question. Let me just ask one to both of our panelists just to get the conversation going. And it picks up on something both of you said. Matthew, you mentioned that Americans, including American Protestants, don't have a shared history. And Angela, you talked about how some of the people you spoke with had this idea of America as Holy Land. So I want to pick up on that and how it intersects with MAGA and Make America Lament, Make America Better. when you walk into a Christian bookstore or visit the bookstall at an evangelical church in the States, you will very likely find books on American history that focus on its godly origins, its divine purpose, this idea that it was founded as a Christian nation. And if evangelicals, or many evangelicals have that sort of view, it would seem that they are sort of by default fertile ground for Make America Great Again, quite infertile ground for lament or better. Because if America was good and godly at the very start, then the project needs to be just make it great again and recover and preserve that godly heritage from whatever enemies may be out there. So Matthew, I'm curious for you as a historian, how does your book, how does your Make America Better approach to history intersect or confront that Christian America mentality? And then for you, Angela, as a pastor, when you encounter that sort of America as Holy Land viewpoint, how do you engage with that from a pastoral point of view? Matthew, first over to you.
Yeah, the question about whether America is a Christian nation is really complicated. And it depends on what aspect you are going to examine with it. But I'll briefly give two answers, and one the right is going to like, and the other the left is going to like. The founders assumed that most Americans would be some sort of Christian and that Christian ethics would pervade public life. So they assumed that Christianity would be a very powerful force within politics. That the right is going to like that statement. However, the Christian nation claim is in one sense the claim that America is a Christ-like nation. But how could a nation possibly be Christ-like during a time when Christians enslaved African Americans or expelled Native Americans or legalized Jim Crow? So saying that the nation was Christ-like during this time insults Christ.
And Angela.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I think my initial response when talking with parishioners about this type of worldview, which is again incredibly entrenched, especially in places where conservative culture is most prominent, to the extent to which in the first chapter of my book, I talk about how leading Southern Baptist thinkers have called Christian nationalism a gospel distortion, which Matthew sort of gets at, that it's become so powerful and so prominent that it begins to distort the gospel of Jesus. But my direct response, I would claim the title of to be a biblicist, and I would like to initially say that the first place we need to go as Christians is not to America's history or to America's founding documents, but actually to the Bible, because the Bible is very explicit about where the Holy Land is. And the Bible is also very explicit for Christians that when Jesus comes in some ways to reject the exclusionism of God before Jesus. And so this idea that there is a Holy Land and that it's America just isn't really supported in the Bible, except the extent to which America can be a place, as Matthew mentions in Make America Better, that America can be a place where each life is valued as created in the image of God, which we find in Genesis.
Thank you. All right, let's go to our audience questions. Here's one from Liam McLean, who's a student here at the University of Cambridge. This is for Matthew, but also it actually picks up on something that Angela, that you had said. And that is, was there as much controversy surrounding Ronald Reagan's slogan, "Let's make America great again"? If so, were the criticisms similar to the ones today? If not, why not? Is it just the invitation of "let's" that makes it better? What makes Trump's claim so much more controversial today? Matthew, I think I'd also like to hear from Angela on this point.
Yeah, I haven't actually given any thought to the controversy surrounding Reagan's claim. I honestly don't know. I know that Democrats have used the slogan as well, very similar slogans to it. And it taps into a bipartisan tradition of decline. As Angela mentioned, a huge percentage of Americans, huge percentage, especially of white Americans, tend to view America as in decline. They disagree over exactly what that decline is, But it's a bipartisan guilty pleasure that Americans indulge in, talking about decline. So I don't know the reaction to Reagan. My guess is that the fear, so it's what gets attached to Make America Great Again. And it's the fear that Trump is going to bring back the most negative aspects of America's past that I think is what brings all the fear with the slogan. Trump has said that he communicates via truthful hyperbole, and that he leaves things intentionally vague. And I think it's this hyperbole, this vagueness, this use of fear, all of these different things make the phrase really inspiring for some, but very scary for others.
Angela, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, Trump began his presidency courtesy of Stephen Miller, referencing American carnage and painting this view of America as dark and crime-ridden, and of course, dark in some ways an allusion to racist ideology, but also this view of America as a dangerous place full of violence. You never would have heard Ronald Reagan talk about America that way. And I actually think Judd is maybe onto something when he talks about that addition of let's, because it brings this, Donald Trump is the first Republican president to popularize, from a Republican point of view, a vision of America that is in decline. I don't think that a Republican president before Trump had made this view explicit for Republicans. And it's a big contrast. And so with Ronald Reagan, for me as a woman, he wasn't a great president for women's rights, but he was a president that had this sunny optimism that, everything's going to be good. It's morning in America again. That's not the kind of rhetoric that Americans have gotten from Donald Trump. And Make America Great Again is coupled with force. It's coupled with force towards immigrants and refugees. It's coupled with force towards protesters. And it's intimidating. The red hats with the slogan. It's very different than the type of campaigning that Ronald Reagan did, that President Bush did, and that any Republican president in the recent past has done.
Thank you. Another question from a Cambridge student. This is David Garcianda Igal. He asks, Matthew, is there cooperation between American Catholics and Protestants in defense of targeted statues of controversial figures? If so, what does this look like? And your focus has been on Protestants, but I wonder, maybe just riffing on that a bit, sort of Catholics and MAGA, and to riff on it further, Angela, I wonder if you spoke also with Catholics as part of your book project and could speak to how Catholicism intersects with the things we've been talking about this evening.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Do you want to start? I was just going to say, I have a chapter on Catholics, and so I guess I'll start. I'll give you time. So I have a chapter on American Catholics, and I also, in January 2020, wrote a cover story for U.S. Catholic Magazine about American Catholic Trump supporters, because Catholics truly, in places like Pennsylvania, places like Wisconsin, the states that were most critical to Trump's 2016 victory, they were actually more important, more influential, and more of a swing vote than evangelicals. So we spend a lot of time talking about American evangelicals, but truly it was white Catholics who broke and really changed, who went from Obama voters to Donald Trump voters. And there's a huge, I notice when I start talking a lot about Trumpism, I start using the word huge all the time. But there's a growing connection you see in somebody like Steve Bannon, who was, after working for the Trump administration, went to work to start, I believe, like a Catholic university in Europe. But there begins to be, and you see it with the Supreme Court in America as well, a huge connection, there I go, between evangelicals and Catholics, where there used to not be in the United States. The KKK actually previously spoke out against American Catholics and saw them as invaders to the American ideal. But there's a growing closeness, and I spent time with this growing fringe of young white Catholics who are openly resistant and even openly hostile to Pope Francis, which is a new development again in American Catholicism and in global Catholicism, with a growing edge of Catholics who see themselves as more loyal to Pope Benedict, previous Pope Benedict, than to Pope Francis. And you also begin to see, this desire to return to the Latin Mass, this desire to return to Catholic traditionalism that was really influential in 2016. But I think that Catholic swing vote, the blue collar labor Democrat sort of vote, Joe Biden is a very attractive candidate to those voters. So I think Catholics are going to be really important to watch in 2020. And if Catholics go back to the Democrats for Biden, that's going to be a big sign for 2020. Sorry, Matthew, tell me what you think.
In addition to what you've said, I think an important aspect as far as images and statues go is the fact that in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, there were many targeted attacks on Catholic churches, on Catholic images, Virgin Mary set on fire, statues of Jesus decapitated. And so it's interesting to see how anger at anger over America's history and wanting to remove symbols of oppression in American history also took on an anti-Catholic, made an anti-Catholic turn for some. And that really hasn't been covered much in the media, these attacks on religious symbols.
Thank you. A question from Marietta Vandertal from the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford. She asks both of you, what would either of you say is the hope or vision that undergirds support for Trump? Is it a re-Christianization of the whole nation, or is it about protecting freedoms of sub-communities? What is the constructive vision, if any? Matthew, you want to go first on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to defer to John Fee's excellent book on it's called Believe Me, The Evangelical Road to Trump. And he argues that a mixture of fear, power, and nostalgia explain a lot of the support for Trump. And I think fear, in the sense, what's the hope and vision? The hope and vision is a world, an America that doesn't have the fears of the immigrants, the fears of people who are different, the fears of minorities taking, all of these different fears that are swirling around on the right. The hope is to have America not have those fears. And that's a lot of what Trump is selling. And then there's also the desire for power. So the desire for power, the willingness to do things in order to gain power, often tied directly to the Supreme Court in the issue of abortion. And then that's coupled with nostalgia about the past. And I think there's a really deep sense in half of America that they don't recognize their country anymore. It has changed so quickly in the last 60 years that they don't feel as if it's their own country. And that sense of being alienated from America, I think, is one of the strongest things that motivates people to support Trump. And that needs to be understood and addressed.
Thank you. Angela.
Yeah, and my apologies in the previous question. I was so excited to talk about American Catholics, I didn't talk about the statues argument. But I think for a lot of American Catholics, because the history of American Catholics is generally a more recent one, that there were, of course, American Catholics involved in colonialism, but the overarching American Catholic type view is a more recent immigrant, so they're not as connected to some of those statues, is what I would say at first, but sorry, I missed that part. So now I lost my train. Remind me we're the hope.
What's the hope or vision? Is it re-Christianization? Is it just freedom for Christians? What's the vision for supporting Trump?
Yeah, so I hear people ask about this, are we afraid of this Christian nationalism wanting to create an exclusively Christian nation? Maybe, but I would agree with John Fee's book, with Matthew. and when you ask what's the hope and vision for Trumpism, I don't think there is one. You know, initially when Donald Trump was trying to begin his campaigning for 2020, initially he was trying to campaign on Keep America Great. But then you've got COVID raging, you've got national reckoning over racism. It was very hard for Trump voters to look around and say, wow, America's great. So then it was almost like, okay, revisionist history, we're going to get rid of these Keep America Great signs, take them down. We're going back to Make America Great again. And I think part of that is a real reflection of an inability of the Trump administration, and for a lot of Republicans who are currently following Trumpism, to cast a positive vision of what America might look like. Trump's campaign has, again, now here in 2020, been ultimately focused on how bad it's going to be if Joe Biden becomes president. You know, the country's going to fall into socialism. There's all this fear, but there's really a lack of a vision of what that might look like. I think the one place, and I don't even know if I would use the word hope to describe it, but the stock market. You know, it's a very zero-sum, very unchristian appeal that Donald Trump's making, saying, you don't want to get stuck with the other guy. What do you have to lose? And your stock market stuff's going to look really good. And it's a very, I don't know, Machiavellian type of appeal, very much lacking in a grand vision for all of America.
Thanks to both of you. Here's a question from Matt Shepard, who's logging in from Omaha. This is again for both panelists, and a very practical question. How do you foster communication between groups when there is an intentional demonization of the other side, regardless of facts or truth? In other words, when people are unwilling to see the other side as valid or attach any charity to their opponents, how can there be any common ground? Who'd like to take a first crack at that?
If you don't mind, I'll jump in and answer here quick, and then I might have to run to my other webinar. So thank you very much, and thank you everyone for attending. So this is much of the work that I have wanted to do as a pastor, and in the aftermath of writing my book, is to find places for dialogue. And particularly, I think it's incumbent upon white American Christians, many of us who live in families, myself included, that have a lot of different diverse political leanings, including Trump supporters. And I think it's really important to have these conversations. B, what I'm always doing as a reporter and a pastor is looking to find points of connection, looking to find points of commonality. And as Jesus calls us to do, to speak the truth in love. So I think it's very important to be honest, to be truthful about what's happening. And I think that dialogues, you're not going to have a productive dialogue necessarily on Facebook with your friend from high school who you haven't talked to in 20 years. So focus on people that are closest to you, have conversations within your own family. And as a pastor, I want to say that the local church is a place where these kind of conversations can be happening and can be grounded in Jesus and in the gospel. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Angela. And if you need to sign off, we certainly understand. Thanks for being so generous with your time this evening.
Thanks, guys.
Matthew, same question over to you.
Yeah, Matt, thank you for the question. So I would say three things are really important: more imagination, more self-criticism, and more empathy. So Americans need more imagination. If you hate Donald Trump, you need to be able to imagine why people voted for him. Until you can imagine voting for him yourself, you're probably not understanding the arguments that make him look like an attractive candidate. Same thing goes with Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton or others. More imagination is needed to see why people vote differently than you. So I think Americans should genuinely be more curious. You know, half the country disagrees with me, and you should be more curious as to why. So the second thing I think is self-criticism. I think self-criticism, there's enormous resources in the New Testament and in the Hebrew Bible for self-criticism. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says the entire Hebrew Bible is a long book of national self-criticism. So I think reframing self-criticism, both of yourself as a voter, but then also of the nation, reframing criticism as a positive thing would be good. And the third thing is empathy. I think so many Americans think that empathy stops critique. But it's only after you've empathized with people you disagree with that real critique can start. So I think looking at empathy with those you disagree with as a positive thing is one of the ways we need to move forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Maybe a final question here, and this is a question that I get asked all the time by non-Americans. And Matt, I imagine you get asked this question a lot too. It comes from Kathy Colton, and she asks, why do we see such a shift in evangelicals to accept and promote a candidate whose character is devoid of Christian values, honesty, integrity, love, joy, peace, patience, and so on? Yes. What is your response to that question?
Yeah, I think that a lot of what happens is there's what's not going on is most evangelicals who support Trump acknowledge that he lacks a lot of those things. And they say that they didn't vote for him because he was loving or had integrity or those other things. So they kind of bracket all of those things on the side and not deal with them. But then there's also a redefinition of honesty. There's a redefinition of integrity that's going on. So if Trump vows to keep people out from the southern border, the fact that he's building a wall shows that he has integrity, shows that he has that he can be trusted. If Trump vows to keep people safe from Islamic terrorism by not letting people into the country and having a Muslim ban, the fact that he does that shows he keeps his promises. So there's not only a bracketing of his more shameful aspects that goes on, but then there's also a redefinition of those things you mentioned: honesty, integrity, love. So I think that's a big part of it.
Good. Well, thank you, Matthew. Well, we're coming to the end of our time, so we should wrap up now. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and summarizing the argument of your book for us. I should have noted at the outset that we will, I believe, be able to follow up with those who have attended this evening's webinar with a code that you can use if you want to get a discount when purchasing Matthew's book. Thanks to all of you who have logged on from the UK and the US and all around the world. Thanks to those who've participated by contributing their questions. Do check back to the website on our website for a video recording of tonight's webinar, and also notices of many more upcoming events hosted by the Center for Geopolitics. Thank you so much.
Thank you.